welcome to Geetam and welcome to the conference, International Conference on Modernity Redefined, Perspectives from South Asia. So Professor Saurabh Dube is a prominent social scientist who is known for his contribution in the discourse of modernity, post-colonial and decolonial studies, as well as his interdisciplinary approach to study human society. So he's currently a professor researcher in the Center for Asian and African Studies at El Colegio de Mexico, in Mexico City. That is the College of Mexico. Yes. So along with numerous research articles and chapters, he has published, he has authored many important books. And I'm not going to name all of them right now, but there are few which are very recent and very interesting. One of them is Subjects of Modernity, Time, Space, Disciplines and Margins. The most recent one is Disciplines of Modernity, Archives, Histories and Anthropologies. And one which he has co-authored and edited in an edited volume, which has a rather very interesting and very fascinating title, is Unbecoming Modern. Unbecoming Modern, Modernity, Colonialism Modernity and Colonial Modernities. So these are some of the very important and significant work that he has contributed to the study of social anthropology, history and social science in general. So we will begin with our interview now. Welcome again.
Thanks very much, and also for the generous introduction.
So try to cut it short.
That's fine.
So I am Dr. Daisy Burman. I teach sociology here at Geetam School of Humanities and Social Science. I have with me my colleague, Dr.
Aritra Saha. I am in the Department of English. We'll begin our question answers.
Okay, so Professor Dube, your works on modernity give us a critical framework to engage with the concept of modernity in general, but also there are very particular aspects of modernity that you deal with. So can you give us some insight on how you approach the concepts of modernity, modernization and modernism from different standpoints or different vantage points?
Thank you. It's a very important question. But let me begin by saying how I got onto the thing. I mean, certainly, in the 1990s, when shortly after finished my PhD work, I'd been reading Anthony Giddens' Consequences of Modernity. I was also reading, I was interested in modernity at that time in historical anthropology. So there were people such as John and Jean Komarov working in South Africa who were writing about questions of modernity. You had people such as other historical anthropologists such as Anne Stoller, who were taking up issues of modernity in their own way in relation to empire. And in scholarship on South Asia, people, I mean, there were various people, but certainly some of the cutting-edge scholars of subaltern studies, which your students would be familiar with or should be made familiar with, they had begun to ask questions about modernity as well. So this was the sort of background, and as I worked towards turning my thesis into a book, I worked on a very untouchable, very large, very heretical community would be considered Dalit now, but wasn't the case then, who challenged upper caste Hinduism. Now, I didn't want to see them, this tendency to see marginal communities as being traditional, as being outside modernity somehow. That, it's outside the modern, that they are traditional and they are opposing something which is the state, which is modern. They're opposing something which is forms of political economy, which are modern. It left me a little cold. So I was trying to bring together the notion of the subaltern together with the notion of modernity, not the modern. So I was trying, and my parents were anthropologists. So my mother didn't really, she pampered me, so she didn't ask me very critical questions. But my father did ask me, and the question was a very simple one. It was, so what do you think is modernity? And so, you speak about it, but what is modernity? And I was rehearsing other people's arguments, but he said, no, what do you understand about it? So in a sense, a very important thing for me was a struggle to try and understand modernity, which is not just a protean, but a contradictory concept. And in doing that, let's say modernity hasn't left me, which also has to, I'm giving a long answer, but I'll go to the modernization aspect. But there was something else as well. The forms of music which I like are actually rock and jazz. And so there was something abiding about the African American practitioners of jazz and rock, but also other practitioners, the alternative, the counterculture, which, these musics have represented. That drew me, in another sense, to understanding the aesthetic dimensions of modernity, the aesthetic and the critically aesthetic dimensions, which also brought up the question of that here are subjects who are creating modern worlds, who are creating modern music, and how are we to understand them, okay? Now this gets me, so you can see what's happening. I'm struggling with modernity, which is a difficult concept, which is used in multiple ways. I'm struggling with modernism by trying to include, by not just seeing it as an art form, which is about high art, or it's about poetry, it's about Baudelaire, but what happens, for example, to a singer such as Billie Holiday? What happens to a trumpeter such as Miles Davis? Okay, because there is something distinctively modernist about it. Now, what do I mean by this? Charles Baudelaire has this notion of the modern as being the ineffable, the fleeting. Now, if you hear Miles Davis, his trumpet has not just a silvery quality, it is at the cutting edge of improvisation. And as a subject, he was as contradictory as he could get. He's African American, but his parents, he's the son of middle class African American. He has middle class African American parents, if I recall right. His father's a doctor. And he's a very contradictory subject because, this thing about Miles Davis was he had fashioned his own clothes. So at a time when, in the 1950s, when you had people wearing those impossibly large padded jackets, Miles Davis was wearing the jackets which he designed himself, which didn't have coats, which didn't have. So, and he was contradictory enough that he played this fantastic music, but also shot himself with heroin. Okay, so what was the nature of the contradictory subject? So this is the struggle with modernism, its contentions, the struggle with modernity. And modernization was, as you would know as a sociologist, has been around in Indian sociology for a very long time in very set ways. So, you try to talk to people as, someone in his early 30s about modernity, and, all these big sociologists would immediately read your points as being about modernization. So I said, I need to figure out what's going on. So that's where the connection between modernity, modernization, modernism, which I see all as connected to each other. I see modernism as movements in art, as music and literature, as a small part of, compelling part, but a small part of modernity. I see modernization as, again, a critical part, but only a small portion of modernity. That doesn't mean they're not important, particularly. And modernity I see as these contradictory, contingent processes, contended processes which extend back to the past 5 centuries.
Thank you so much. So this brings a follow-up question.
Yeah, sure.
Just for clarity of the audience and both of us. So when you talk about modernization as a part of the greater project of modernity, so
Process.
process Process is a bit, yeah. So when we even use the word process, so we immediately can relate it with some kind of a movement. So modernization, do you mean that modernization has a certain trajectory that is going towards something, and modernity is something that we cannot talk about in a movement kind of a form because it's going everywhere?
Well, I mean, I think actually what happens is that modernization becomes very important. But the real rise of modernization as a term begins to happen when? It begins to happen in the 1950s. It's at that time, this is often forgotten, but it's at that time that W. Rostow, who is an economist but who is a part of the Cold War, comes up with his book on modernization, whose subtitle actually is A Non-Communist Manifesto. So it's a part of the Cold War. Rostow is a part of the US thing, and what he wants to say is, it's an agenda for what's going to happen to it's not yet called the third world, but what's going to happen to these countries which have soon become independent. And there's a step-by-step idea of development, where in Indonesia or in India or Gabon or Togo have all got to rise to the same thing as West, and then of course in the process they might fall behind. So, so the idea is basically of a kind of and this is then projected on to the notion of modernity, or the image of modernity. So modernity is like a kind of, is like a road, or there's a road which is of development, historical development, and modernity is a bus. Imagine this, and this is a conversation, which is moving forward, okay? Some people have climbed on top, others are like hanging on to windows, some are falling off from behind, some have already fallen, and guess who's sitting comfortably inside? It's, the white folk, typically understood as the white man. It's Mr. Rostow driving the bus. Now, this has an enormous impact on sociology, whose distillations you found. Of course, we need to recognize that there are earlier imaginings of notions of modernization, which can be read, for example, in the work of Max Weber, but that's a lot more complex and contended than the way in which it is understood. For example, writing in the 10s and 1920s, unlike Mr. Rostow, Dr. Rostow, Max Weber was a very sad human. He didn't like the iron cage of bureaucracy. For him, modernity was not a blessing. And perhaps it's important that we are sitting in the 2020s now, and it's a similar mood of despair. So, just in terms, not academically, but just in terms of aesthetics and sensibilities, perhaps this is not a wrong time to revisit modernity because of the kind of situation we find ourselves. Does that help, or do you want me to?
Yes, definitely. And the example, that analogy is brilliant. I think it's very, it would stay with us when we get confused in our way of teaching modernity. Maybe in our future, we would also have to go and teach modernity to our students. So that example would stay with us and would be very, very helpful. So moving on, again, you have urged us, young researchers and social scientists, through your work, that we should focus on the contradictions that are there in modernity. That you have mentioned it in the previous question as well. So can you just elaborate or walk us through how you, in your words, modernity, you look at modernity as a Janus-faced phenomena? Can you please walk us through or elaborate a little?
Yeah, so it's sort of featured in what we were talking about earlier, particularly the talk which I gave. Modernity is seen as the birth of democracy, the birth of development. Modernity is something which is about reason, and it's about freedom, and it's about. But what we often forget is that the very moment you have the birth of democracy, you also have deaths by genocide of indigenous people. At the very moment you have democracy, I mean, I'm speaking of the United States now, at the very moment you have democracy, it's at the cost of someone, it's at the cost of slavery. Okay, so I mean, can we then actually think in terms of the, this leads us to think of the undemocratic foundations of democracy. Democracy is founded on slavery, and the undemocratic foundations of democracy as a phrase actually tells you about the contradictions of modernity, right? I mean, it's a concrete example, but it's not just about, it's not just about, for example, a founding moment of democracy. It's not just about the fact that, so modernity, yes, is about, how should one put this? Modernity is about a lot which is, in some senses, seen as progressive. Reason. So, you heard this morning about reason being propounded as this fundamental principle. Well, what kind of a pure reason is it being imagined when the interplay of, where reason's own ambitions were always expressed in relation to race? Right? And I'm not talking in general terms here. What I'm trying to say is the following. So, let's just consider the fact that, one, this idea of a pure enlightenment, which was singular, doesn't work. If there was, the enlightenment was more than one, okay? It was contended. So if you have the French analytical tradition, you also have, you have forms of British and Scottish enlightenments, which are much more, particularly the Scottish one is very skeptical. You have someone like Kant, who's actually trying to bring together the strongly analytical of the French tradition and the and the skeptical tradition. So we often forget, we sort of render all this as all one part of a thing. Are you for enlightenment? Are you against? You have to see those contentions, that contradictions. And now, in relation to your point, you have someone like Hume, whose skepticism means that he can't take the aggrandizements and of an analytical reason that seriously. And yet, what he can't countenance, and yet, what he can't take is the fact that blacks can be equal to whites. And that's where I think, despite his skepticism, a certain a certain skepticism cannot enter what we might call the dark recesses of Enlightenment thought. They're dark because they just can't take it. So and this leads to why is this happening? This happens because the Enlightenment and Western thought, Western male thought, has to be seen as self-birthed. What is it missing? Self-birthed, because what is it missing out? Is the prior presence of Arabic thought, of African practices, of South Asia. So there's an empirical question, but it's also about self-births, and these are the contradictions. It's not, as what we need to recognize is that it's not that Enlightenment is good or Enlightenment is bad. I'm sorry, like most of the world, Enlightenment is good and bad. It can be very good and it can be pretty horrible.
Same with technology, same with digital revolution. Same.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, absolutely. It's about recognizing the this and that of stuff.
Yeah, we live through these contradictions on a daily basis. So yes. So moving on. Now I'm going a little further.
Please.
And trying to understand your approach to multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary necessity, especially when it comes to history and anthropology. You have talked at length and written at length how these two disciplines should have an interaction. So if we put history and anthropology in this room, what kind of dialogue can we expect, or should we expect from that kind of from that kind of a scenario when we put history and anthropology to have an interaction, to have a dialogue?
I think the dialogue between history and anthropology is already underway in our conversation. But, because there's a reason why I say that. Because I don't take disciplines as already taken for granted, settled categories. So one part of the answer is the following. One part of the answer is that it's not that you decide, oh, I'm going to bring together history and anthropology. It's about, or different disciplines. It's about what are the questions which what are the materials you're dealing with? What are the questions you're asking? What are the subjects you're studying? Subjects in the sense of, what do they demand? What do they demand? What are their requirements? What are their calls? Do they want you to, are their calls actually about bringing not just history and anthropology, but cultural geography? What about bringing in, I had to learn so much when I got interested in working on art, modernism, for example. I had to learn so much from disciplines, from my abiding interest in art. It became, learning from literary critics, from art critics. Now, that's neither history nor anthropology, but that doesn't mean, so what was it, what was being asked of me? That's the other part of it. And then the history anthropology question specifically, usually the tendency is to see, the dialogue or conversation between history and anthropology as one between two settled, taken for granted disciplines. Okay? So history is about archives, history is about the past, history is about dynamics, anthropology is about tradition, anthropology is about fieldwork, right? Now actually, my interest, when I started writing about it and I thought of the idea of historical anthropology, one of the matters which came up for me was what are the ways in which we unsettle this way of doing historical anthropology? What are the ways in which we begin to ask those difficult questions about, is that really how we think about history? What are their mutual admixtures? So that history is seen to be about time, anthropology is seen to be about space. But what are the ways in which, what have they shared and how have they talked past each other? What has been the influence, for example, of Durkheim on, anthropological tenets of functionalism and structural functionalism? Durkheim, this meant that they didn't want to understand, they wanted to understand societies in abstraction from change, right? And what's happening there? When you want to understand societies, cultures in abstraction from change, you are actually setting up a difference between the dynamic time of the Western sociologist, anthropologist, and the traditional time of the native. You're already back to the temporalization of space and the spatialization of time. Yeah?
Thank you so much for your answer. Very intriguing one. This obviously it's going to make us think about the relationship, make us think about the generally taken for granted interdisciplinary approaches that we talk about in social science, contemporary social science, and specifically. So Arindra will take over the interview now.
Yes, I have a couple of questions.
Please.
So the first one is, you have spoken about the Hindu identity. I would like to know your thoughts on how modernity has shaped or evolved Hindu masculine identity.
Great question. Really important question. So one, so the Hindu identity and Hindu masculine identity, both unsurprisingly linked with each other, develop in relation to both empire, Hindu identity, and Hindu masculine identity. I'll rephrase the question partly because I think your reference is to modern Hindu identity. Because Hindu asmita has been talked about for a long time. I don't know what that means, and we need to focus in some senses on. So the question of modern Hindu identity is, of course, tied to Hindu masculine identity, or the Hindu understood in terms of the masculine figure. And it's in relation to this masculine figure that you have a certain feminine figure of the nation which comes in as well, which is Bharat Mata, for example. But, who is the savior of the Bharat Mata? It's the valiant sons, right, of the Mata. Now, where does all this arise? It's been shown that modern Hindu identity clearly develops in relation to, as counter to empire, but even that even before that, to the British colony. And I'm making the distinction between colony as sort of continuing till 1857 and empire coming in after that, which is very kind of technical and a partly, what is it? What's the term? The term is, those guys who are stuck on gadgets and so on. Anyway, so it's the term will come back to me. So what you have is this distinction, because really from the first half of the 19th century, there are contestations of empire. There are other creations of the idea of of the Hindu identity. There is this identity is Hindu masculine identity because whatever the reformers are saying, the so-called conservatives want to save Indian women, or Indian tradition from the presence, as it were, of the white man. Now, what's happening is, as Gayatri Spivak famously put it, it's a struggle for brown men and white men fighting with each other to save brown women. Right? Now, what I'm getting at through this particular example, which is made, in passing, is some of Gayatri's best formulations are, what it brings up is the question of how modern Hindu identity doesn't just rise in relation to opposing empire. It is about the articulation of a Hindu nation. And it's important to keep, we tend to separate empire and nation, and this is one of the contradictions of modernity which you brought up earlier. But actually, empire and nation go hand in hand. It's early articulations of the nation, but let's not also, this period we are speaking of around the mid-19th century, mid-19th century, is also early anticipations of empire. Empire doesn't come fully formed. It comes as this project of domination, which imposes itself in one way. And this is a part of it. When you said modernity is a movement, I said, no, it's a process, because processes are contradictory. So are movements, but, movements understood as processes. So, these are processes which are where you have actually a manner in which they are unfolding, they are being elaborated by subjects, they're taking different forms, and it's within these interstices that you have the formations at once of a modern Hindu identity, which is about a modern Hindu masculinity. It's a very worried masculinity. It's a masculinity which feels that the white man is going to emasculate us. It's an anxiety about the fact that we're no longer men, and this feeds directly into the present in some senses. And I wouldn't just say the present, the moment right now, the contemporary moment, but when India exploded the atomic bomb, there was celebration. This was 1990s, I think. This was 1980s and 1990s. And it doesn't matter which leader it was, which party, and frankly, I sort of forget, or I sort of remember as well. This guy said, we are no longer a nation of hijras. Okay, now I think this goes to the core of modern Hindu identity. Modern, it's about an incipient nation, but then it becomes about a strong nation. We know, we are actually men.
Potency of a nation.
Sorry?
Potency of a nation.
Yeah, it is about the potency of the nation. Nation is about desire. Nation, just as empires were. But nations have a greater intimacy. Empires are never that intimate, right? I mean, imperial intimacies are different. They themselves about white men trying to save white women. Those are imperial intimacies from native men. National intimacies are much more, are much closer to home, because they are actually about becoming more and more potent. They're about becoming actual men, which you want. So, I'm not saying it's the same situation today as it was yesterday. That would be too. But sometimes it helps to bring up critical juxtapositions, and that's why I said it's a great question, because it helps us think of those connections, not just between colony, empire, nation, post-colony. It helps us think about the place of sexuality, of the place of gender, of the place of the constructions of different identities, within this gitch pitch. And gitch pitch is a serious term, huh? I mean, we think gitch pitch is, academics think gitch pitch is bad. No. Actually, history is gitch pitch.
So I'll move on to the next question.
Yes.
I would like to know, how has your experience of living in Mexico changed your understanding of the Indian modernity? Has it changed, or has it influenced?
One part of it is, it's a great question again, but I would rephrase it if I may. How has my living in Mexico changed my understanding of modernity at large, which influences how I understand the Indian modern and modernity in India? Is that? And I think there are a number of key issues there. So one is the fact that, don't forget, I was talking about this time when I was trying to grapple with modernity, and was trying to I was writing the first book, where I brought in, but I wanted to bring together the subaltern subject as a subject of modernity, of colonialism, rather than be of some inhabitant of a timeless tradition, right? Now, it's in the process of writing this it's in the mid 1990s that actually, I move along with my partner, my wife, who's also a historian and anthropologist, who's also worked on the sect, to Mexico. Now, one part of it, there are various things which happened, including in relation to Mexico, but one of them, and this influences my understanding of modernism and via that to modernity. So what happens? I was trained in a school called Modern School. I was trained where we were junglies as kids, or as adolescents, but at the same time, the emphasis was on a certain kind of discipline. Then I attended the Anglican St. Stephen's College. My PhD work was, history in Delhi University, history, so taught in a particular way. You had to clear exams, you had to write in a particular way. And then Cambridge, and Cambridge history, although I did something quite different, was nonetheless about retaining control. Now when I reached Mexico, I'd read literature from Latin America, but it's the use of language, including in academic argument. It's the way, the textures of life. It is the kinds, it opened a whole world. It opened a whole world. And one of the first pieces I wrote, not out of the earlier, but out of the later stuff, one of my friends said, you need to go a bit easy because the metaphors and the colors and the smells have begun to pile up, okay? Now this influences the understanding of modernism, but what it does, it also brings in other kinds of questions to the fore, and that's why. One is the relationship between colonialism and modernity. In discussions in South Asia till that time, if you look at it, including, when Partha is writing Our Modernity and Deepesh is going into some of these questions and others, there's very little writing there till then. What's happening is that colonialism is seen as something, the immediacy of colonialism has not gone. Indian independence is still only about 40-45 years old. So there's a kind of an affective charge about colonialism. Modernity is still good, okay? Whereas in Latin America, most of Latin America, colonialism has become, a dim and distant thing, to be thing. Present in architecture, Baroque music, because what has come to the fore instead is the nation. And it's the relationship between modernity and the nation. So one of the things which happened was I discovered the writings of these people, some of whom were mentioned. The names are not important here, but the so-called decolonials and so on. The early, sort of stirrings there, they were saying there is a relationship between colonialism and modernity. Okay, it's present. Right? So a part of it was to recognize one's everyday worlds that actually the colony is not long gone. We've lived in a neighborhood which is 16th century. The churches are pre-Baroque and then they become Baroque, and that was a certain kind of modernity. Okay, certain kind in the sense that it's not just a prior figure. So, do you see how the shifts are taking place? And it's in this relation that I begin to ask this question of, rather than our modernity, which I'll say this, which for Partha Chatterjee is very much Bhadralok. Not even completely Bhadra Mahila, it's Bhadralok modernity. The R is Amader Adhunikta. Okay, the point is for Deepesh again, it's forays into modernity which are about worlds of Bhadralok, and he's bringing in gender, but he's bringing in gender in terms of the figure of the Griha Lakshmi. We don't need to go into the details. So I'm saying there's a certain kind of a way in which the address of modernity is being understood for the Swiss stalwarts. Actually, there's a certain irony, who had spoken about subalterns. They're going back to their own identities. Why? Because the subaltern cannot be modern. So I stood vindicated, for one, that they're my teachers and seniors and friends, but I stood vindicated that I was right in pressing this relationship between modernity and obviously this has implications for the way in which one thinks of not just the relationship between, for example, the past and the present, history and anthropology, but as well as one understands the terms of the present. And you begin to understand, there are parts of India which are, you begin to understand the importance of places which are haunted if you're willing to look. Hauntings which are actually, which are concrete, which are palpable, and there are parts of India which are very haunted. Delhi is very haunted. You have jinns, you have people who make pacts with jinns who write legal applications, there's a great book called Jinology about it. But we have forgotten those Delhis, right? We've forgotten those Delhis, we've forgotten those Bangalores, we've forgotten of symmetries, and we've forgotten. And I think what I was reminded there is in terms, again, since going back to your actual question, what are the terms of hauntings? What are the terms of the affective? What are the terms of the subalterns in understanding of modernity at large, with implications for India, recognizing that these worlds have always been very connected. One part of it is to understand it through oceanic worlds, there's gate work going on, but you don't need oceanic worlds. The terms of haunting, they float around, right?
That's wonderful. The answer is actually it's enlightening, and it is also connected to your answer. Surprisingly, is connected to my next question.
Yes.
I wanted to ask: can the subaltern be a modern subject?
Okay, so the subaltern is already always, not in pre-colonial times, but after modernity comes up. And thank you for asking that question, because it takes me back to the second question which was asked earlier. So the subaltern understood as the indentured laborer, as the peasant working in jute mills, but also as the peasant in places of indigo farming, the landless laborer who is toiling away for her masters, who are paying taxes to states and regimes, including colonial ones. All these are figures. Don't forget that it's not just who are your immediate rulers. Don't forget. We need to remember these are wider. They are wider structures and strictures of world trade, of cotton, which is going around, of jute, of indigo, which are moving around. So what you have is a situation where these are all subjects of modernity, right? Subjects, because they are subjects of modernity in the sense they are subject to the power of these processes, okay? Of empire, nation, economies. I'm speaking of economies, of different exchanges, and we can take any number of examples from creolized worlds and so on and so forth. But you get my larger point, right? And but the other question is, are they modern subjects? Now, I took the example of Miles Davis, but Billie Holiday is a gendered subject. They're subjects of modernity, but they are also modern subjects. They're modern subjects who are giving a particular twist. Now, that's a kind of, and they're not heroic modern subjects. We can take figures like that. One cures himself of that heroin addiction, but Billie Holiday dies of lost loves and alcoholism, both of which speak of music, of the hauntings of love, of what she didn't get, and so on, right? It's about creating. So they are modern subjects, but they are modern subjects with a difference, which is why one idea of the modern subject. So subjects of modernity, yes, but yes, in these worlds also you have different kinds of, different kinds of modern subjects. So I think in the very performance of tradition, there's a folk form called Pandwani in Chhattisgarh. Its greatest practitioner was Tijan Bai. Tijan Bai is a subject of modernity, of capital, of these shows which are held, of the patronage of the Indian state. But she's also something of a modern subject, because she's not just, she is reproducing, she's creating, when she says she's reproducing tradition, she's already introducing a difference into it. I don't know if the two of you would remember that there's a film, a very sad one, about called Masi Sahib, made by Pradeep Kishan, who was once married to Arundhati Roy. So Pradeep Kishan makes this film. He has a home in Pachmadi, in Madhya Pradesh, where there have been conversions. And he makes this film called Masi Sahib. And Masi Sahib is about an Indian convert to Christianity who has adopted Western dress. I don't know what exactly he is, but there were many figures like that. My other concrete sort of project is on Christianity, evangelism, evangelical entanglements. So there are many other figures like this. There were people who were called compounders. There were people, who wrote, who became clerks, who worked in the mission organization, converts who had literacy. Masi Sahib wears Angrez kapde, he even puts on a tie, but he is an Adivasi convert to Christianity. And he's a very sad figure who's a subject of modernity, he's also a modern subject, trying to be another kind of a modern subject. But his being a modern subject lies in being not just a subject of modernity, lies in its failure to become the modern subject he wants to be. He's forsaken both by the Sahibs and he's forsaken by his own community. So yes, there are subaltern subjects who can be modern subjects, but it's always the modern and subject with a difference.
That's insightful. I have one last question.
Please.
Not monolithic. Can you elaborate on?
No, I mean, all that we've been talking about in some senses is about, it's seen as the singular beast, it's seen as monolithic. What I'm trying to say when I'm speaking about it as a process is that there are multiple movements there, if you will. Movements not, of movement forward or backward, but there are multiple movements there, the lateral movements, and these are contradictory processes which have been, So if the question is, what do I mean by it's not monolithic? It's about the critical heterogeneity of modernity, and which is what makes its subjects also, critically, crucially heterogeneous. Okay, I mean, that's that heterogeneity which exists in entanglement, which exists as part of processes, as parts of subjects who are hanging on to prior traditions, lagging behind, trying to, it lies precisely in the densities of those processes. And this is not to say that it's a tremendous conceit which says that the worlds weren't changing before these processes of modernity came around. One of the most fantastic books on art history I've read is actually, which shows the interrelationship, I'm talking about Europe now, the interrelationship between the so-called late medieval artist Hieronymus Bosch and the early modern artist Peter Bruegel. And in terms of a book on Bosch called Bosch and Bruegel, there's this fantastic analysis of how they were both speaking of deeply theological but also deeply modern, not but alongside deeply modern worlds in which much was being transformed. So it's this entire conceit which the modern and modernity have, that change begins before. The world's been changing for a long time. What sorts of changes were not there before, whether in India or in Europe. There's a certain idea of the modern that before this was the medieval and it was dark ages. I'm sorry, far from that. There's loads which was happening. We just need to learn to look and see, including the images, including the beliefs. We need to sniff and smell.
So this brings us to the concluding question of this session. We'll not keep you for longer. So the last question. So Professor Dube, you belong to a family of scholars who have set the foundation of sociology and social anthropology in India. And so how much Professor Leela Dube and Professor S.C. Dube have influenced your academic choices in particular and as well as your academic journey in general?
Okay, great question, and give me a few minutes to answer it. So, not necessarily an easy question to answer, because in many ways it's the very it contains the very, and it's founded on the very heterogeneity which I brought up. So a part of it was the fact that very importantly, very seriously for me, the experience of growing up in Sagar, not the Sagar in Karnataka, but Sagar in Madhya Pradesh, in a university town, which is also a cantonment town, which is also a tobacco town. It's a producer of beedis. That, that's left me with certain kinds of memories and textures and, and sort of lineaments of worlds, which I wouldn't have found if I had grown up in Delhi like a lot of my friends, who went to modern school and so on. This was because there was something about the coming together, growing up in a home of anthropologists' parents who were, teaching in a university, which was pretty important then, meant that there was the presence of the cosmopolitan, right? But at the same time, that presence of the cosmopolitan existed in worlds, including of the university, including of my friends' families, which were completely linked to the vernacular, as it were. So, my opening, my experience from the beginning was about this interplay between the cosmopolitan and the vernacular, in which these worlds overlapped, and yet they met each other only in curious, in contradictory, in very quirky ways. And perhaps, that was the beginning. I'm speaking as, I wasn't thinking like this in these words, but it's sort of formative experience of what you're living with, your friends' families. It begins, when you're 6, 5, 6, 7, and it becomes a kind of it becomes a structure of sensibility, a texture of experience, which I can't live by. So, I have always in that senses, looked in to the situations I am in from the outside. And I'm not the only one. You don't need to go through the same kind of experiences as me. But there was something formative about that. And that comes up out of these worlds, these mismatched worlds. And perhaps that, gets me to this entire business of what I want to work on. There are other things which happen. For example, cutting my apprentice historian's teeth. Subaltern studies has happened. They're my teachers. We're really excited, not just me. Our friends in undergraduate in undergraduate days who go on to become, who know that they're going to go into the civil services, but there's a certain excitement there. What you were talking earlier about, that you do sociology not just for a degree. It wasn't about, they were going to go into the IS, but that doesn't mean that they're not completely excited about what's going on. So I'm being trained in history, and yet what is happening about anthropology is that there's certain questions which subaltern studies guys are not asking. They still see the subaltern as traditional. I'm not on to the question of modern. They don't see caste as importantly as in a manner in which it should be seen in terms of its importance. And obviously some of this is come from having heard discussions at home, critiques of Dumont, rejections of Dumont, more balanced. My father was never really interested in Dumont. My mother wanted to understand. So this, you see these contrary kind of tendencies. So when I start doing my master's and I'm studying with Shumit Sarkar, it's this bunch of feelings. The fact that I want to take subaltern studies project in terms of I want to read it in terms of my own questions. I want the importance of caste, the importance of religion. In the class with Shumit, he's trying to bring together history and anthropology, and I'm asking questions about Dumont, where there is a certain prior past which allows me to ask certain kinds of questions, Knowledge is not born out of somewhere. since you asked the question, I'm answering it in a very honest way, but with instances. So, when I wanted to look at the conductive resistance in a religious idiom, okay? And my father said, well, why didn't you work on the Satnamis? And my mother sort of agreed. So he said, who are the Satnamis? Because they weren't a part of the historical record. Now, that's because both my parents had done their early rounds of fieldwork in Chhattisgarh. And also my father had actually grown up in Chhattisgarh because his father was a manager of Port of Wards. So there I was, go off to Chhattisgarh, start working on the Satnamis, discover incredible archives, and then, during my PhD, sorry if I'm going on a bit, I go to Chhattisgarh to do field work. And what so I was 25, but I'm told, or Ishita's told that I look like really young. Who's not willing to talk with me? The older women. And they're clear instances of forms of sexual exploitation. They're not even going to talk to this boy about that stuff, right? So, two things happened. My mom actually reached Chhattisgarh and she bolstered my worse than fledgling efforts, on questions of gender and kinship. Okay, complicities, but nice ones. And my father did these two fabulous interviews, particularly with a woman called Mogra, who was like his age. She had come to Bhopal for something with her granddaughter in a performance. My father found out, called her, very poor, very subaltern, Satnami. And she came, she was given tea, she sat down, they were talking in Chhattisgarhi. And my father had very good Chhattisgarhi. So she put her feet up on the wicker chair, they sat and talked for 3 hours. That's the most incredible interview I've come across done for me. So, these are the concrete things, but then that question, what is modernity? But I think the final thing, if you want to say, is I am actually glad that I left India because I didn't have to carry the baggage of, one part of it was joining history. My older brother was 11 years older. He died a couple of years ago. He went in for sociology. I don't know why he did that. And everywhere he would go, he would be asked, Dube's son, the Dube's son. And he'd get really upset and say, by the biological accent and not being his father, see Dube's son, right? Of his being my father. I didn't have to face it. I was a different character anyway. You see me, laugh. He was he's older, right? They bear this burden. I think the fact that I didn't have to bear that kind of identification, because who knows? Maybe the smile would have disappeared. Maybe I would have been unhappy if I had been. But don't forget, I was in history. I was not in anthropology or sociology. But, my brother did sociology. So I think what helped was that you're not carrying any kind of baggage. You're not, you're more footloose and fancy free.
Do you feel completely out of my baggage? Because there is some kind of association when we talk about Saurabh Dube. There is always some kind of reference to. So, why do you call it a baggage? It can also be an honor.
It is an honor, but it's always so this goes to the core of your questions about heterogeneity, contradiction, modernity, modern subject. So, let's consider now S.C. Dube and Leela Dube and Saurabh Dube as both modern subjects and subjects of modernity. Okay, so they were doing this book, which you might have come across, on the founders of Indian anthropology, edited by Satish Deshpande, who's going to speak tomorrow, Nandini Sundar, and Satish, Nandini, and Patricia Oberoi. So one of the qualifications for being in the book, the anthropologist had to be dead. So Srinivas and Dube had died recently. Sorry, I'm a bit macabre, but that's true. They died. So, they asked me to write on Srinivas or Dube. You'll have to explain to your students who they were. So I thought about it, writing about my own father, but I said writing about Srinivas's disciples wouldn't tolerate it. Dube's son writing about Srinivas, so I chose Dube. Anyway, I wrote the essay, and my idea was that rather than celebrating this figure, can we see the terms and textures of his life as contentious, as divided? I wrote the essay, 30 pages, draft, sent it to my mom. I got comments back on it, 40 single-spaced pages. She didn't type it, they had been typed, where she was said, basically they said, you don't understand Dube. And it took some time, but after 3 or 4 years, she had understood. So baggages which are, which are ironic, which are painful, which are textures, which bear textures of life. No, thank you very much for your questions.
Thank you. On that nostalgic note,
It's not nostalgic. It's not nostalgic. Although nostalgia can be good, it's not nostalgic. It's about the presence of the past. They're haunted.
Okay. On that note,
yes,
we conclude today's interview. Thank you so much for sitting with us and talking with us, Professor Dube. And once again, welcome to Bangalore.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you very much.